The alien soldier woman said, "My emperor ordered me to kill you." Then she dropped her weapon. Captain Elia's cane stepped carefully over the cracked metal floor of the abandoned outpost. The wind howled outside, carrying clouds of red dust that turned the horizon into a blur. He adjusted the strap of his utility pack and scanned the area, his eyes catching the faint glow of a broken console. The outpost was silent, too silent. For a human explorer, silence was never just quiet, it was a warning. Elias had been sent here to check on a research station that had gone dark for weeks. There were rumors that alien patrols had passed through the region recently, but no matter what he might encounter, he trusted himself to handle it. He had trained for hostile environments before. He had survived situations most humans would flee from, and yet, stepping into the outpost, he felt a strange tension. Something was waiting. He crouched behind a rusted support beam and approached the central chamber. The door to the main hall hung at an odd angle, almost torn from its hinges. Beyond it, shadows moved, though he could not yet make out their source. His hand hovered near the blaster at his side, but he kept his voice low, trying not to startle whatever, or whoever, was inside. "Hello," he called softly. "Is anyone here?" The silence returned, but this time it carried weight. It was not natural. It was the silence of someone or something, watching him, calculating his next move. Elias stepped forward, boots echoing against the metal floor. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. She was taller than a human, with lithe, powerful muscles visible beneath the dark armor she wore. Her skin had a faint, bluish sheen, and her eyes were sharp, almost glowing in the dim light. A weapon rested easily in her hands, trained on Elias' chest with deadly precision. "My emperor ordered me to kill you," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of hesitation. Elias froze, not out of fear. He rarely feared anyone, but because of the calm certainty in her tone. She was not a mindless soldier. She was highly trained, disciplined, and dangerous. Yet something in her posture suggested she was not fully committed to the act. "I see," Elias replied, keeping his hands slightly raised but showing no real threat. "You must be very loyal to your emperor. That's admirable, but it won't work on me." The alien soldier's eyes narrowed. "You do not understand. Loyalty is everything. Obedience is everything. Without it, I would be nothing." "And yet you hesitate," Elias said softly. "You are more than what your emperor says you are. You can choose." Her grip on the weapon tightened, then relaxed. The sandstorm outside rattled the walls of the outpost, sending loose debris clattering to the floor. For the first time, she glanced away from him toward the shaking roof. Elias seized the moment. "The storm is getting worse. If we stay here, neither of us will survive. We should find shelter." She blinked as if the thought had never occurred to her. Her training, her life, had always been about one thing: obeying orders. Survival or caution was not a concern unless the emperor commanded it. And yet she sensed truth in his words. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her weapon slightly, though she did not let go of it. Elias noticed the subtle shift. It was not trust, not yet, but it was curiosity, a small spark of something he had not expected in a soldier conditioned to kill. They moved together through the outpost, searching for a safe room. The hallways were narrow, filled with broken equipment and scorched walls. The storm outside roared, shaking the structure as if it would crumble. Elias offered his hand when they reached a section of floor that had cracked dangerously. She hesitated, then accepted it briefly, her touch firm and cautious. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice low. "I help people when I can," Elias replied. "Sometimes it's instinct, sometimes it's choice, but it's always better than standing alone." Her eyes softened slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elias noticed. "I do not know this feeling. My life has always been orders, obedience, efficiency, kill or be killed." "And now you are faced with a choice," Elias said gently. "To kill or to survive, or perhaps to do something neither of us expected." They reached a small command room. Broken screens flickered faintly, and a few chairs had collapsed under the weight of time. Elias inspected the equipment quickly, using the few functioning consoles to check the environmental systems. He noted that the shelter was barely holding, and without immediate repair, it would fail before dawn. The alien soldier, Lyra, as he would learn her name to be, watched silently. Her breathing was steady, but Elias could see the conflict in her eyes. Her loyalty demanded action, but her mind, her instincts, were now questioning the command she had always followed. "Name?" Elias asked finally, attempting a friendly tone. She hesitated. "Lyra." "Lyra," he said, nodding. I'm Elias. We'll need to work together if we want to survive the night. Can you do that? Lyra glanced at her weapon, then back at him. Finally, she nodded once. I will try. Elias smiled faintly, though inside he felt the weight of the moment. She was powerful, deadly, and trained to follow orders. Yet here she was, choosing to cooperate even for a single night. That was remarkable. Humans often believed that strength came from weapons or armies, but Elias knew that true strength often came from choice, the courage to act differently than what was expected. As they worked to stabilize the shelter, Elias shared basic survival tips. He showed her how to use emergency power modules, how to reinforce weak walls, and how to find the safest positions when the storm hit hardest. She absorbed the information quickly, following his instructions with precision and efficiency. Yet every so often she would glance at him as if testing him, measuring his reactions. You are calm, she said finally, her voice quiet. Even facing someone who might kill you, you do not panic. Elias shrugged. Humans are not always calm. But we survive best when we think clearly. Panic is a luxury we cannot afford. Lyra considered this. Your species, it is strange. You do not fear death as much as you fear failure. Failure is what kills us in the end, Elias replied. Not a weapon, not a storm, not an emperor. Mistakes do, and we learn to survive them. Lyra did not respond immediately. Instead, she went to the edge of the room, scanning the flickering shadows outside. The storm made everything indistinct, the wind howling like a living thing. Yet in the chaos, she felt a rare sense of security, not from the walls, but from Elias' presence. He had not shown fear. He had not forced her hand. He had simply existed, and that was enough to make her question her purpose. Hours passed. The storm raged on. Elias and Lyra worked together to reinforce the shelter, sharing minimal rations. Neither spoke much, yet each observed the other, learning subtle details. Lyra noticed how Elias' hands moved with care and precision, how he stayed calm under pressure, how he treated the broken machinery as if it were a living thing rather than scrap. Elias noticed the disciplined grace in her movements, the way her eyes scanned for danger even when none was visible, and the quiet struggle behind her unwavering exterior. As night fell, the storm outside reached its peak. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape. The shelter groaned under the wind, and Elias placed a hand briefly on Lyra's arm to steady her as a particularly violent gust shook the room. You trust me, he said simply. I do not know if that is the correct word, she replied, but I will follow your guidance at least for now. Elias nodded. That is enough. Trust is not a word, it is a choice we make every moment. For the first time, Lyra felt something she had not experienced in her life. The possibility of freedom, not from enemies, but from the chains of obedience. She was a soldier, trained to obey, yet here she was, making a choice, small perhaps, but significant. As the storm continued to rage, Elias settled near the flickering console, checking the stabilizers. Lyra stood silently at the edge of the room, weapon lowered, watching him work. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what it would mean to act for herself, rather than for the Emperor's command. And as the night deepened, with the wind screaming outside and the shelter groaning under the pressure, a silent understanding formed between them. They would survive the storm together. How much beyond that remained uncertain, but for now the choice was theirs. And that alone was enough to change everything. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving a strange silence across the planet. Red dust settled over the ruins of the outpost, turning the landscape into a canvas of desolation. Captain Elias Kane stepped out first, scanning the horizon. The sky was pale and the distant mountains cast long shadows. Lyra followed closely behind, her weapon slung loosely at her side. Her armor still bore scratches from the storm, but she moved with practiced grace, alert to every sound, every motion. Elias led the way toward a ridge that could give them a clearer view of the area. The sand was still loose, making each step a small effort, but he moved steadily. He glanced at Lyra, noticing how her eyes tracked his every move, analyzing and learning. She had always been trained to follow orders, but now every step they took together was a silent negotiation, a test of trust. You are quiet, Elias said finally. Do you always follow orders without question? Lyra shook her head slightly. I have until now. My life has been obedience, discipline, and execution. I was trained to follow the Emperor's commands without hesitation. To doubt is considered weakness. And yet, you hesitate now, Elias replied. That hesitation is not weakness, it is strength. It is proof that you can think for yourself. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You speak strangely. Humans value emotions over orders. Loyalty is not measured by obedience, but by what? By choice, Elias said simply. By deciding what is right, even when the easy path is to obey blindly. Humans survive because we can adapt, because we can act beyond fear or commands. Lyra considered this. She had seen humans fight and die, and yet she had also seen them protect, forgive, and endure beyond reason. This was different from anything her military instructors had taught. She had been told that humans were reckless, that they acted without strategy. Yet Elias moved carefully, intelligently, and without fear. She began to understand that strength came in many forms. The ridge provided a better view. The ruined outpost stretched behind them like a wound on the planet, and far in the distance, smoke rose from what appeared to be a patrol camp of the Emperor's forces. They were moving in formation, unaware that Elias and Lyra had survived the storm. Elias crouched and pointed toward the patrol. We need to avoid them. Their sensors are strong. If they spot us, it won't matter that you hesitate. They will act instantly. Lyra studied the patrol, calculating the distance and the best route. There is a ravine ahead, she said. We can use it to move without being seen, but it is difficult terrain. You may struggle. Elias smiled faintly. I have walked harder paths. Lead the way. As they moved through the ravine, the conversation continued, though carefully measured. Elias asked about Lyra's world, about the Emperor, the army, and her life as a soldier. She answered cautiously, revealing details without betraying secrets that could endanger them if overheard. My training began when I was very young, she explained. We were taught that loyalty is the highest virtue, obedience above all. The Emperor is not questioned. We were taught that humans are dangerous because they choose. And yet, here you are, Elias said softly, choosing to protect me instead of killing me. Lyra hesitated, then said, I am curious. There is a conflict I do not understand. Something inside me questions the command. I do not know if I am wrong or right. That conflict is what makes you human in your way, Elias replied, or at least capable of human-like choices. You see, we value the ability to decide. That is why humans survive when the odds are against us. They reached the other side of the ravine, where jagged rocks and sparse vegetation created small cover. A faint stream trickled through the sand, a rare sign of life on this harsh planet. Elias knelt and tested the water. Safe to drink, he said. We should rest briefly. Lyra observed him silently as he filled a small container. She had never needed to consider such mundane survival skills. Her training had always focused on combat, discipline, and execution. Yet now, she was learning from a human who survived without brute strength, relying instead on knowledge, observation, and calm reasoning. As they rested, Elias shared simple stories of human life, of planets where survival was just as harsh but humans had thrived. He spoke of explorers who traveled through unknown galaxies, of scientists who studied dangerous creatures, and of ordinary people who acted with courage every day. Lyra listened, absorbing each word. She found herself comparing it to her own life, realizing how limited her understanding had been, constrained by orders and obedience. The day passed slowly as they moved toward the outskirts of the patrol zone. Small obstacles tested them along the way, a narrow ledge over a deep chasm, a sudden cliff that required careful climbing, and pockets of unstable ground. Each challenge demonstrated the synergy between Elias and Lyra. She provided the skill and strength, while he provided the ingenuity and guidance. Together, they overcame obstacles neither could have handled alone. During a brief pause near a cluster of rocks, Elias looked at her. You know, if we survive this, you will have a choice beyond this moment. You can return to your Emperor or you can act for yourself. The choice is yours. Lyra's eyes narrowed and she looked down at the sand. I do not know what it means to act for myself. My life has always been planned. Orders, missions, obedience. To choose freely, it is frightening. Freedom often is, Elias said softly. But it is also what makes life worth living. Obedience may keep you alive, but choice allows you to grow, to become more than a weapon. She studied him carefully, as if weighing every word. Then, after a long moment, she said, Perhaps I want to understand this freedom, even if it is dangerous. The patrol's lights flickered in the distance. Elias signaled for silence and they moved cautiously, using shadows and rocks for cover. The patrols were methodical, scanning the terrain in sweeping patterns. Ilias calculated their movements, timing each step and pause carefully. Lyra followed, silent but alert. When a patrol soldier nearly spotted them, Lyra instinctively raised her weapon, but Ilias placed a hand on her arm. "Wait, let them pass. No need to kill when avoidance works." Lyra hesitated, then lowered the weapon. It was a small act, but significant. She had chosen restraint over aggression, guided not by orders but by observation and reason. Ilias noticed it immediately and gave her a subtle nod of approval. Hours later, as dusk approached, they reached a shallow canyon that provided temporary shelter. The sun cast long shadows, and the temperature began to drop rapidly. Ilias gathered some sparse vegetation and rocks, building a small fire to provide warmth. Lyra watched him, fascinated by the simplicity of his actions. He did not rush, yet the fire was effective, controlled, and reliable. "You make it seem easy," she said finally, breaking the silence. "It is not always easy," Ilias replied, "but careful observation and patience make difficult things manageable, even survival." Lyra considered this. "I have always been taught that strength is enough, that skill and obedience ensure victory. You show me strength is not enough, there is something more." "Yes," Ilias said, smiling faintly. "There is always more: courage, wisdom, patience, empathy. All of these matter, sometimes more than weapons or training." As night fell, they huddled near the fire. The cold wind howled through the canyon, but for the first time, Lyra did not feel entirely trapped. She had followed orders her entire life, yet now she was experiencing something new, a small taste of independence, the possibility that she could act on her own decisions, guided by choice rather than fear or command. Ilias looked at her thoughtfully. "You have survived countless battles, Lyra. You are one of the strongest soldiers I have ever met, but true strength is not just power. It is understanding, restraint, and the courage to make choices others cannot." She remained silent, staring at the flames. Slowly, she began to understand. Her life had been dictated by orders, yet here she had made choices. She had not attacked him. She had followed his guidance. She had used her skill and intelligence for survival, not destruction. It was the first step toward something she had never imagined: autonomy. The night stretched on, quiet except for the fire and distant sounds of the planet. Ilias and Lyra did not speak much, but each observed the other. The bond of trust, fragile but growing, began to form. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Lyra finally spoke. I am not sure what comes next, but I will follow your guidance, at least for now." Ilias nodded. "That is all anyone can ask for. Step by step, we will figure out the rest together." For the first time in her life, Lyra felt a sense of hope. Not hope tied to orders, duty, or command, but hope tied to choice, survival, and the possibility that life could be more than obedience. And as they prepared to continue their journey across the harsh planet, both knew that the challenges ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. But for now, they had each other, and that alone was enough to face the unknown. The morning sun glimmered over the jagged ridges of the desert planet, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. Captain Ilias Kane and Lyra carefully navigated the rough landscape, moving cautiously toward a cluster of abandoned structures that might provide temporary shelter. Though the storm had passed, the planet still felt hostile. Harsh winds and unstable terrain made each step a small test of skill and endurance. Lyra walked beside Ilias, her senses alert to every sound. She had survived countless battles, yet something about this quiet, desolate planet unnerved her. It was not the danger from predators or the elements. It was the unpredictability of a human beside her. Ilias moved with careful observation, relying on knowledge and intuition rather than brute force, and she found herself increasingly curious about him. "You are careful," Lyra remarked, her voice low. "Most humans would rush across terrain like this. They would stumble or fall." Ilias glanced at her, smiling faintly. "Careful observation keeps you alive. Panic leads to mistakes. I learned that a long time ago." Lyra considered this. In her world, survival had always been about following orders and using strength to dominate. The idea that patience and careful thought could match, or even surpass, raw skill was foreign. Yet, watching Ilias move, she realized he was effective precisely because he thought ahead. They reached a ridge overlooking the abandoned structures. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, and Ilias' sharp eyes caught movement. "We're not alone," he said quietly. "The Emperor's patrols are active. We need to move carefully." Lyra followed his gaze. The patrols were methodical, scanning the area with advanced sensors. Their formations were disciplined, a stark reminder of the training she herself had endured. Yet now, she was no longer part of that regimented army. She was making her own decisions, testing what it meant to act for herself. Ilias motioned for her to follow a hidden path along the ridge, using rocks and shadows as cover. Step by step, they descended, careful not to trigger any sensors. Lyra's instincts told her to prepare for attack, yet Ilias encouraged caution over confrontation. It was a subtle lesson in restraint, an idea she had rarely practiced. The path led them to a narrow canyon. Its walls were high, jagged, and unstable, but it offered temporary concealment. Ilias examined the entrance, then motioned for Lyra to follow. "We can move through here, but it will be slow. Watch your footing." Lyra obeyed, moving with deliberate care. Each step tested her balance and strength, but she noticed how Ilias helped without interfering. He offered guidance without taking control. It was different from anything she had experienced in her life as a soldier. Here, she was learning not just to survive, but to think independently. As they progressed, Ilias began asking her questions about her life. "When did you first join the Emperor's army?" he asked. Lyra hesitated, then replied, "I was trained from a young age. Obedience was drilled into us as the highest value. Strength alone is not enough. We are taught that without loyalty, skill is meaningless. All of life is obedience." Ilias nodded thoughtfully. "And yet now you hesitate. You make choices that go against that training." "Yes," she admitted. "It is frightening, but it is also intriguing. There is a sense of freedom in acting for oneself, even if it is dangerous." The canyon narrowed, forcing them to move in single file. Small rocks tumbled underfoot, sending echoes through the tight space. Ilias paused, scanning ahead. "Sensors up there," he whispered, pointing to a ridge above. "We need to time our movements. Patience is our advantage." Lyra studied the sensors carefully. Her training had prepared her to attack, but Ilias' words encouraged her to consider another approach: avoidance, strategy, and calculation. It was a small but profound shift in perspective. Hours passed as they navigated the canyon, the tension building with each careful step. They avoided several patrols, using cover and terrain to their advantage. Each near encounter strengthened Lyra's understanding that strength alone was not always the key to survival. Observation, timing, and cooperation mattered just as much, lessons she had never fully embraced until now. During a brief pause near a small rock ledge, Ilias noticed Lyra studying him. "You are learning," he said quietly. "Not just survival skills, but something more important, how to think independently." Lyra's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I do not know if I am ready. My life has always been structured. Obedience is my instinct. To act for myself, it is unfamiliar, but I feel capable." "You are capable," Ilias reassured her. "That is why you are still alive. That is why you are here with me. Your skills, combined with choice, make you stronger than you realize." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, they emerged from the canyon into a clearing. The patrols were closer now, their formation tighter, their sensors scanning systematically. Ilias surveyed the area, calculating the risks. "We have to move quickly," he said. "There is a structure ahead. It may provide temporary safety, but we cannot linger." They approached the structure cautiously. It was a partially collapsed building, its walls scarred and pitted. Inside, remnants of old machinery and broken furniture created obstacles, but it offered shelter from patrols and the elements. Ilias led the way, checking for traps or hidden sensors. Lyra followed, her weapon ready but lowered, showing her willingness to cooperate rather than dominate. Inside, they found a small room with a functioning communications console. Ilias inspected it quickly. "We might be able to get a weak signal," he said. "It could help us understand the patrols, positions, and movements." Lyra observed silently. Her training would have made her destroy the equipment and move on, but Ilias' approach emphasized survival, knowledge, and strategy over destruction. She found herself questioning her past methods, wondering if obedience and strength alone were enough to truly succeed. While Ilias worked on the console, Lyra stood guard. Her senses were heightened, scanning for threats. She noticed subtle signs that the patrols were coordinating, preparing for an operation that could trap them if they were discovered. Her experience as a soldier allowed her to anticipate their movements, but she no longer followed orders blindly. Instead, she used judgment, guided by reasoning and instinct. Elias glanced at her, noticing the change. "You are thinking differently now," he said. "Not following commands, but analyzing, predicting. That is true strength." Lyra considered this. Strength had always been measured by obedience and skill. Now she realized it could also be measured by wisdom, patience, and restraint. She felt a new sense of purpose forming, a combination of her abilities and her emerging autonomy. As night approached, the desert cooled rapidly. Elias gathered some debris and fashioned a small fire for warmth. Lyra watched him carefully, impressed by his resourcefulness. In her life as a soldier, she had never experienced survival in such a simple, deliberate way. Humans often relied on ingenuity over brute force, and she now understood why that approach could succeed where strength alone failed. "You make it look easy," she said finally, breaking the silence. Elias smiled faintly. "It is not always easy, but careful observation, patience, and adaptation make it manageable, even when everything seems against you." Lyra nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. I see. My training, it has always emphasized power, obedience, efficiency, but you show me restraint and reasoning can be more effective." "Yes," Elias said. "Strength without judgment is dangerous. Judgment without strength is useless. Together they create survival." The night deepened, with stars scattered across the sky like tiny fires. Elias and Lyra sat near the small fire, the quiet crackle of flames filling the room. Each reflected on the journey so far, silently acknowledging the changes within them. Lyra had followed orders her entire life, yet now she had begun to act for herself. She had chosen restraint over aggression, strategy over force, and trust over suspicion. Elias studied her silently. He saw a soldier learning to become more than her training, discovering the value of choice, and understanding that true strength lay not in obedience but in wisdom. "You have survived battles I cannot imagine," he said finally. "But true survival is more than skill or training. It is courage, reasoning, and the ability to act for yourself. That is what you are learning now." Lyra considered his words. For the first time, she felt hope that her life could be more than obedience. She could make choices, take responsibility, and act according to her own judgment. It was frightening but exhilarating. As the fire burned low, Elias prepared for the next day's journey. The patrols would continue to search, and they would need to move carefully to avoid detection. Lyra stood beside him, her weapon ready but her stance relaxed. She no longer moved as a soldier following orders blindly. She moved as someone who had begun to understand the meaning of choice, freedom, and collaboration. And as they rested for the night, a quiet understanding formed between them. The journey ahead would be dangerous, the challenges severe, but together they had begun to learn a truth that neither could have discovered alone. That strength, courage, and choice combined could overcome even the most relentless enemy. For the first time, Lyra felt she was more than a weapon. She was a soldier who could choose, a fighter who could reason, and a being capable of trust and empathy. And beside her, Elias represented the humanity that inspired that change, showing her that even in a hostile universe, courage and wisdom could shape the future. The following morning, the desert stretched endlessly, its red sands reflecting the weak sunlight. Captain Elias Kane and Lyra moved cautiously, the ruined outpost now far behind them. Every step required attention. The ground was uneven, filled with hidden crevices and jagged rocks. Elias led the way, scanning for movement, while Lyra followed closely, her eyes alert to the smallest sign of danger. "We need to find a safer path," Elias said, pointing toward a series of rocky ridges in the distance. "The patrols will be searching the area systematically. Staying in open terrain is too risky." Lyra studied the horizon. She had spent her life on battlefields, but navigating without clear orders was new. Her training had always given her commands and objectives. Now she relied on her own judgment. That thought made her uneasy, but she felt a strange thrill in the uncertainty. They moved silently, using shadows and natural cover to avoid being detected. The patrols, a few kilometers away, were scanning methodically, unaware that Elias and Lyra had survived the storm and evaded them. Elias calculated the patrols' movements, timing their steps carefully, teaching Lyra without words how to use patience as a weapon. "Why are you helping me?" Lyra asked quietly as they navigated a narrow passage between two rock formations. Elias glanced at her. "I help those who need it, not because I'm commanded to, not because it's a duty, but because it's the right thing to do." Lyra frowned slightly. In my world, doing the right thing is defined by orders. To help without orders, it is strange. Strange, yes, Elias said with a faint smile, but effective. It is also freeing. You realize that, don't you? Lyra hesitated, then nodded slowly. She had begun to understand. Obedience had kept her alive, but choice, deliberate action guided by thought and judgment, offered a different kind of strength. She was learning that her skill could be combined with reasoning and restraint, creating a force more powerful than any army following blind orders. The rocky ridges led them to a small canyon hidden from view. The narrow entrance provided temporary safety, but it also presented challenges. Loose rocks threatened to give way, and the walls were steep. Elias examined the canyon, identifying a path that minimized risk. "You lead, Lyra," he said. "I will follow and assist when necessary. You need to apply your judgment, not mine." Lyra glanced at him, surprised. Her training had never allowed for independent decision-making in critical situations. Yet she nodded and took the lead, moving carefully. Each step was deliberate, calculated, and cautious. Elias followed, offering occasional guidance, but letting her take responsibility for the path. Hours passed as they moved through the canyon, avoiding hidden hazards and using natural cover to remain unseen. The patrols were closer now, their sensors active and scanning for any signs of intruders. Elias observed, timing their movements so that the patrol's patterns worked to their advantage. Lyra watched him, absorbing the lessons in patience and strategy. "You are clever," she said quietly. "I would have rushed headlong. I would have relied on my strength alone." Elias shook his head. "Strength alone can only take you so far. Intelligence, timing, patience, and observation extend that strength. Sometimes survival is about waiting, watching, and acting at the right moment." Lyra considered this. Her training had always focused on efficiency and obedience. Success meant following orders without hesitation. Now, she was learning that sometimes restraint and judgment mattered more than skill or strength. It was a revelation that unsettled her, yet she felt a growing respect for Elias. As dusk approached, they reached a plateau overlooking a valley. The valley below was dotted with small buildings and patrol units. From this vantage point, they could see the patrols clearly, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Elias pointed out weak spots in the formation, teaching Lyra how to identify opportunities for movement and avoidance. "This is where choice matters," he said softly. "You can fight, but that may lead to unnecessary risk. You can hide, wait, and move at the right moment. That choice can save your life." Lyra observed the patrols, her mind analyzing possibilities. For the first time, she felt the thrill of autonomy, the ability to choose her path, guided by reasoning rather than command. It was a strange freedom, and she felt exhilarated and nervous at the same time. "We need to move across the valley," Elias said. "There is an abandoned structure on the far side that can provide temporary shelter. If we time it right, we can avoid detection." Lyra nodded, focusing on the task. "I understand. We will move carefully, step by step. Timing and observation are key." The descent into the valley was slow. Each step required balance and attention. Loose rocks threatened to give way, and the patrol's sensors swept across the terrain in calculated patterns. Elias guided Lyra silently, signaling when to pause, when to move, and when to take cover. At one point, a patrol came dangerously close. Lyra instinctively raised her weapon, ready to fire. Elias placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. "Wait, they cannot see us. No need for aggression." Lyra hesitated, then lowered her weapon. It was a conscious choice, a demonstration of restraint over instinct. Elias noticed and gave her a subtle nod of approval. She felt a sense of pride, though she did not fully understand it. For the first time, she realized that survival did not always require violence. Hours later, they reached the abandoned structure. The walls were damaged, but the building offered shelter from observation and the elements. Inside, they found remnants of old machinery and a weak communications signal. Elias inspected the equipment, attempting to gather intelligence on the patrol's positions. Lyra stood guard, her senses heightened. She had been trained to anticipate attacks, but now she used that skill in service of reasoning and judgment, not blind obedience. She realized that her understanding of strategy was evolving, her choices mattered as much as her skills. Elias glanced at her. "You have changed," he said. "Not just in skill, but in thought. You are learning to act for yourself." Lyra nodded slowly. "It is difficult." My life has always been defined by orders. To act for myself, it is frightening, but I feel capable. Yes, Elia said. That is the first step. Strength alone is not enough. Courage, reasoning, and the ability to choose are equally important. Night fell over the valley and the temperature dropped. Elias built a small fire using debris and vegetation, creating warmth and light. Lyra watched him, fascinated by his resourcefulness. In her life as a soldier, she had never experienced survival in such a deliberate, patient way. Humans relied on ingenuity as much as strength, and she now understood why it was effective. "You make it seem simple," she said quietly. "It is not simple," Elias replied. "But careful observation, patience, and adaptation make it manageable. Survival is about using your mind as much as your body." Lyra nodded, absorbing the lesson. "I see. My training emphasized strength, obedience, efficiency. But you show me patience, observation, and reasoning are equally important." "Yes," Elias said. "Strength without judgment is dangerous. Judgment without strength is useless. Together they create survival." As the fire burned low, they rested. Lyra reflected on the journey so far. She had followed orders her entire life, yet now she had begun to act for herself. She had chosen restraint over aggression, strategy over force, and trust over suspicion. It was a small transformation, but significant. Elias observed her silently. He saw a soldier learning to become more than her training, discovering the value of choice, and understanding that true strength lay not in obedience but in wisdom. "You have survived battles I cannot imagine," he said finally. "But true survival is more than skill or training. It is courage, reasoning, and the ability to act for yourself. That is what you are learning now." Lyra considered his words. For the first time, she felt hope that her life could be more than obedience. She could make choices, take responsibility, and act according to her own judgment. It was frightening but exhilarating. As the night deepened, they prepared for the next day. The patrols would continue searching, and they would need to move carefully to avoid detection. Lyra stood beside Elias, weapon ready but posture relaxed. She no longer moved as a soldier following orders blindly. She moved as someone discovering the meaning of choice, freedom, and collaboration. And as they rested, a quiet understanding formed between them. The journey ahead would be dangerous, the challenges severe, but together they had begun to learn a truth neither could have discovered alone. That strength, courage, and choice combined could overcome even the most relentless enemy. For the first time, Lyra felt she was more than a weapon. She was a soldier who could choose, a fighter who could reason, and a being capable of trust and empathy. And beside her, Elias represented the humanity that inspired that change, showing her that even in a hostile universe, courage and wisdom could shape the future. The first light of dawn barely broke through the crimson haze of the desert sky. Captain Elias Kane and Lyra stood at the edge of a rocky plateau, surveying the patrols below. The Emperor's forces had intensified their search overnight, deploying more sensors and scouts across the terrain. Every movement was measured, every step forward could trigger detection. Yet Elias and Lyra had survived storms, treacherous cliffs, and narrow escapes. Now the ultimate test awaited them, the choice between obedience and freedom. Lyra's hand rested lightly on her weapon, but her posture was relaxed. For the first time in her life, she was not acting on orders. She was choosing her actions, calculating risks, and trusting her instincts. Elias observed her silently, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor. Her hesitation had been replaced with focus, her obedience with judgment. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a strategist, a partner, and a human in the truest sense. "We can use the canyon ahead to cross," Elias said quietly. "The patrol's sensors don't reach that deep. It will be slow but safer. From there, we can reach the ridge leading to the abandoned outpost where we can signal for extraction." Lyra studied the terrain below. "It is risky," she said. "The sensors cover most of the valley. If we are seen, the Emperor's forces will attack immediately." "Risk is part of survival," Elias said. "You are capable of more than you know. Trust yourself." Lyra nodded. For the first time, she did not need an order to act. Her choices were guided by reason, observation, and her newly discovered courage. She led the way, carefully descending the plateau toward the canyon entrance. Elias followed, ready to assist but letting her take responsibility for each step. The descent was slow and treacherous. Loose rocks threatened to give way, and the patrols below moved with precision, scanning the area relentlessly. Lyra paused frequently, listening to the rhythm of the sensors, predicting their sweep patterns and guiding their path. Elias moved in tandem, impressed by her growing confidence and strategic thinking. Hours passed as they navigated the canyon. Every near encounter strengthened Lyra's understanding that strength alone could not ensure survival. Observation, patience, and calculated decision-making were equally, if not more, critical. She began to feel exhilarated by the freedom of choice, the power of thinking independently, and the responsibility of protecting herself and Elias without reliance on orders. As they reached the midpoint of the canyon, a sudden alert echoed from above. Patrols had noticed unusual activity. Sensors activated, scanning the canyon in sweeping motions. Elias froze, signaling for Lyra to take cover. Lyra acted instinctively, pressing against the canyon wall and observing the patterns of the sensor sweep. "Wait for the next cycle," she whispered. "We can move when the sweep passes." Elias nodded, silently acknowledging her command. It was a turning point, the student leading the teacher, the soldier acting independently. When the sweep moved past, they advanced carefully, keeping to shadows and narrow ledges. The patrols detected faint movement but could not pinpoint their location. Elias and Lyra pressed forward, their coordination flawless. They reached a narrow exit at the far end of the canyon that led to a small ridge. From this vantage, the abandoned outpost could be seen, its structures silhouetted against the rising sun. "We are close," Elias said softly. "From there, we can signal for extraction. But the patrols will see us if we move recklessly. We need a plan." Lyra studied the patrols below, calculating angles, timing, and movement patterns. "If we split," she said, "we can distract their attention. One moves to the ridge while the other draws the sensors away briefly. We can reunite at the outpost." Elias considered the suggestion and smiled. "You are learning quickly, let's do it your way." Lyra moved first, keeping low and using rocks and shadows for cover. Elias followed, signaling when to pause. Her plan worked perfectly. The patrol's sensors were briefly diverted, giving them a window to reach the ridge. From there, the outpost was visible, and they could see the weak signal from the communications console. They reached the outpost and entered cautiously. The building was partially collapsed, but functional enough to provide shelter and a working console. Elias activated the device, sending a brief signal for extraction. While the signal transmitted, Lyra stood guard, her mind calculating the patrol's next move. "You have changed," Elias said quietly. "Not just in skill, but in thought. You are acting independently, guiding our survival, not following orders blindly." Lyra nodded. "I understand now. Strength and obedience are useful, but wisdom, judgment, and choice are more powerful. I am not just a soldier, I can be more." Before Elias could respond, the outpost sensors detected movement. A squadron of Emperor's forces was approaching, their weapons trained on the structure. Lyra did not panic. Instead, she analyzed the situation. "We have two options," she said. "Fight or escape. Fighting now is risky, the patrols have the advantage." "Then escape," Elias said. "We have a signal out, we just need to hold long enough." Lyra nodded. She activated a series of old security systems in the outpost, creating distractions. Flickering lights, automated doors opening and closing, small explosions in unoccupied sections. The patrols were momentarily confused, giving Elias and Lyra a chance to move. They slipped out of the outpost, moving swiftly toward a small plateau where the extraction shuttle could arrive. Lyra's strategy and Elias' coordination allowed them to evade the patrols entirely. Each choice they made relied on judgment rather than force, a demonstration of the power of independent thinking. As they reached the plateau, the sound of the approaching shuttle echoed across the valley. Elias checked the signal device. It was still transmitting. Lyra scanned the horizon, her eyes sharp and alert. For the first time, she felt fully in control of her fate. The shuttle landed smoothly, kicking up clouds of red dust. Elias and Lyra boarded quickly. As the hatch closed, Lyra finally lowered her weapon fully, her mind at ease for the first time. She had chosen her path, acted independently, and survived without reliance on orders. Inside the shuttle, Elias turned to her. "You did well, Lyra. You were a soldier, yes, but more importantly, you were a thinker, a strategist, and a partner. You chose, and that choice saved us both." Lyra's eyes softened, a rare moment of emotion breaking through her disciplined exterior. I never thought I could act for myself. But now I understand. Freedom is not weakness, choice is strength." Elias smiled. That is what makes humans strong: courage, reasoning, and the ability to choose even when the odds are against us. That is why we survive. Lyra considered this, reflecting on the journey they had endured: the storm, the patrols, the treacherous terrain. Each challenge had tested not only her skill but her understanding of choice, autonomy, and trust. She realized she had grown beyond her training, becoming more than a weapon or a soldier. The shuttle rose into the sky, leaving the desert planet behind. Below, the patrols could only watch as their quarry escaped, unable to understand how a human and a soldier had outwitted an entire Emperor's search operation. Elias and Lyra sat in silence for a moment, both absorbing the significance of their survival. The bond between them had strengthened, not through orders or duty, but through trust, cooperation, and the power of choice. "You have changed," Elias said again. "Not because I led you, but because you chose to act, to think, and to survive. That is the essence of strength." Lyra nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities ahead. She could return to her emperor, continue as a soldier, or embrace a new path, guided by judgment, wisdom, and freedom. For the first time, she understood that her life could belong to her, not to orders, not to obedience, not to fear. The shuttle cut through the clouds, carrying them to safety. Lyra gazed out the window, watching the planet fade below. She had survived storms, patrols, and treacherous terrain, not because she followed orders, but because she had chosen to think, to act, and to trust herself. Elias glanced at her and smiled. "The universe is vast, Lyra, dangerous, yes, but full of possibilities. You now understand that strength is not just power. It is courage, wisdom, and choice. That knowledge, that makes you unstoppable." Lyra returned the smile, a rare moment of connection between human and soldier. She had learned more than survival. She had learned the value of freedom, judgment, and partnership. She had discovered that even in the most hostile universe, courage and reasoning could overcome obedience and fear. As the shuttle flew toward distant stars, Lyra felt a sense of purpose she had never known. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a being capable of choice, capable of reasoning, capable of shaping her own destiny. And beside her, Elias represented the humanity that inspired that change, showing her that even in a universe filled with danger and command, strength guided by choice could redefine fate. For the first time, Lyra smiled fully, not as a soldier obeying orders, but as a being who had chosen her own path and embraced the power of freedom. The galaxy stretched before them, vast and full of unknown challenges. But now she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next, not as a weapon, but as a thinker, a partner, and a survivor. The Emperor's forces below could only watch, unable to comprehend how a soldier and a human had outwitted them, not with brute force, but with intelligence, courage, and choice. The story of their escape would remain a lesson, a quiet testament to the strength of reasoning and the power of freedom in a universe often ruled by orders and obedience. Elias looked at Lyra one last time as the shuttle ascended. "You did well. You are no longer just a soldier. You are a survivor, a thinker, and a fighter in every sense that matters. The universe has many challenges ahead, but you are ready." Lyra nodded, her heart steady. For the first time, she believed in herself, not in orders, not in obedience, not in fear, but in choice. And that choice, she realized, was the ultimate strength. The shuttle disappeared into the distant stars, carrying them away from the desert planet and into a future defined by courage, freedom, and human-inspired resilience. The journey had changed them both. One had taught, the other had learned, and together they had discovered the essence of survival: strength guided by choice, reason, and the courage to act beyond orders. The galaxy waited, vast and unknown, but Lyra and Elias were ready. And for the first time, the soldier and the human understood that survival was not just about strength, but about the choices that define who they truly were.